Andrew Fox, you know him well on the show, defence expert. He's a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. He's also a former major in the Parachute Regiment. A very good afternoon to you, Andrew.
Hi, Julia.
Thank you for joining us. So a lot of debate over the Strategic Defence Review yesterday. Just in terms of just a brief summary of what there was announced that you do support in terms of, you know, spending money, 2.5%, this ambition of the 3%, in terms of what it's going to be spent on these nuclear submarines, munitions factories and the like. Have they got the right priorities at least?
I think so, roughly at the strategic level. They're making the right noises, quite frankly. And we have to remember that a strategic defence review is the big hand stuff. It's where the government of the day wants to get to with defence. It doesn't go into the sort of the granular detail of how many tanks we have or how many divisions or you know, how many soldiers in an artillery battery. That's not what it's, that sort of detail is not what it's involved with. So when we're talking about reindustrialising our, you know, our ammunition supply, good thing. When we're talking about building more submarines to establish deterrence to our enemies, that's a good thing. When we're talking about looking at the future and how we network and use autonomy in drones and things like that, also a good thing. So there's stuff in there which I really like. You know, looking after our service personnel better is in there. Recruiting better is in there. These are huge.
And those do make a difference. Having decent accommodation. That, you know, I think it's 1.5 billion being announced for accommodation, because a lot of, I mean, basically, it's accommodation. It's not good enough for asylum seekers, but it's good enough for our servicemen and women and their families. So that will, in terms of retaining good people, is absolutely vital. But this debate has been so much about, and it's absolutely fascinating. No one even mentions the actual billion-pound numbers. You know, like, what does it actually mean? 2.3% currently, pushing it up to 2.5% by later in this decade. Talk about 3% early next decade. Again, that assumes, you know, whoever's in power then makes that decision. But a report in the last 20 minutes or so suggests that NATO is going to push to basically to increase defence spending for each country to 3.5% of national income, and basically say, look, that, you know, where we are right now isn't really touching the sides, and if we want to be a leading nation in the alliance, we are going to have to be spending an awful lot more. And we know that some of the countries in the Baltics, Poland, although much smaller economies, we know that Germany, a big economy, bigger than us, that they are actually spending a lot more now. They are, I think, from a very low base in Germany, admittedly, but pushing to spend a heck of a lot more. Do we need to be moving to that sort of figure?
It's a matter of selling the threat to the British people and justifying why you're spending that much of GDP on defence when there are huge problems with
not on nurses, not on,
So are we in a place in the UK where the threat is quite as real as it is for Eastern Europe or Germany? Probably not. And I think that is the political constraint that sits on this document, is that the money's going to have to come from somewhere. Now, the SDR is very clear that this is an alliance-based plan, which I think in itself is really interesting.
What does that mean?
So it means that everything we do is as part of an alliance. We are designing our armed forces to fit into NATO first.
And so part of that will be that we spend a lot more on nuclear, as one of the two, France and Britain, the only nuclear power European nations. So we spend a lot on that. So we'll have fewer, say, land forces as a result, because that's our contribution.
Yeah, exactly. And what that means is we lose a lot of strategic autonomy. What happens if Argentina reinvades the Falklands? I mean, it's not going to happen because the Argentinians are extremely weak. I'm just using it as an example. Do we have the ability to conduct anything beyond a quick non-combatant evacuation?
I mean, we don't, I've been told by numerous military figures.
Yeah, we don't now, and we're not going to under this defence review. So we've traded strategic autonomy and the ability to do stuff on our own for a role in NATO that will hopefully be a leadership role. But if we now look at how the Europeans are kind of cutting our legs away with their new defensive fund and how they originally wanted to cut us out of it, I think that's a dangerously short.
But also, even, I mean, quite apart from the fact that not one of our allies, including America, came to our aid when Falkland Islands were invaded by Argentina. But in Europe, we've seen the dragging of the feet by the EU over help to Ukraine when we were just getting on with it and America was getting on with it. There is a lot to be said, in or outside the EU, to not have our our military and foreign policy, and again, these go hand in hand, in any way constrained by, yes, our friends, our neighbours and our allies, but we are, because we're a naval nation, we have, colonial commitments as well around the world that many of those countries don't, that we do actually have different national interests quite a lot of the time to those nations. We shouldn't constrain ourselves in that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there is a danger here that this review over-focuses on Russia to the exclusion of any other threat anywhere else in the world. I mean, it talks about small-scale counter-terrorism stuff of the line that we've done against ISIS or Daesh in the Middle East. But that was primarily a special forces operation supported by airstrikes. It wasn't a conventional military deployment. And essentially, those conventional military deployments are looking like a thing of the past under this review.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the thing about all of this is, does any of it really touch sides of what we really need? Now, I mean, you're right. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that Russia is going to suddenly appear on a whole load of boats and then their military invade our country. Of course not. That's not what happened, in the Second World War with Germany either. There was seizing of European nations. We were under threat from the air, under threat from sea and everything, but a lot of our actions was to defend our allies in Europe and prevent that advance from the Nazis. The threat from Russia is further afield. Is it as real, though? That's the thing, because we spoke to Lord Dannatt this time yesterday, former head of the British Army. He probably knows what he's talking about, eh? And he said that in terms of our attempt to, these funds to build up our military to the point where we were capable of defending ourselves and our allies, it was the equivalent of us saying in 1937 to Nazi Germany, would you mind awfully waiting until 1946 before you invade other countries because we're not ready yet? Do you think that's the territory we're in now?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that if we're serious about supporting the Eastern European Baltic states for what is almost certain to be an attack by Russia in the next 10, 15 years.
You say almost certain?
I would say so. And I think the way it'll be done will be exactly the playbook that we saw in Georgia and that we saw in Ukraine, where it starts with subversion, it starts with disinformation, it starts with sabotage operations, it starts with serious messaging against domestic governments on pro-Russian domestic populations.
Yeah. More Russian-speaking populations moving to those places as well.
Yeah, exactly. And only then will they escalate to military action if they think those are until the conditions are set, ready for their military force to actually go. And that does take time, and that's the time we have now to get ready for that defensive piece. And again, in the SDR, it's good to see that we're talking about resilience to that kind of grey zone operation, as they call it.
I get the very strong impression from all the military people I speak to that certainly former military more able to speak out. There's no reason to think they think very differently from the military people right now, the senior echelons and junior echelons, that they get it. They believe there is a threat. We've got Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, talking about an imminent threat to Taiwan from Xi Jinping of China. And again, no reason to think that isn't the case. Russia has been building up forces, near the Nordic states. He's expressed his desire to expand, back to the sort of basic Soviet borders at some point. The military get it. Is it clear that the politicians get it, and is it clear that the bean counters, the civil servants, get it?
I think Keir Starmer has had a good Ukraine. In his time it's probably his single best thing. So I think he does understand it. And again, the Treasury is always where the blockage is. And if you speak to Ben Wallace, for when he was in the Defence Secretary job, that is his, the clear target of his criticism is always the Treasury. But you can see why, because there's a limited amount of cash. So one of two things: we either take it from somewhere else or we raise taxes, neither of which are politically popular decisions. So short-term political expediency often takes priority over these things, where in countries like Russia and China, where they don't have to worry about their electorates, they can think much more long-term than we do. And that is a perennial problem for Western democracies when they're planning for their own defences.
I mean, one of the key things about defence spending is it takes a heck of a long time to deliver. It takes a heck of a lot of money to deliver as well. So you need to be planning always, way in advance. And we know that we've got, Ukraine's on a war footing. They have to be. Russia is on a war footing. Certainly the Chinese are on a war footing. You look at, were they spending something like 8% of their GDP on military now, building up most extraordinary forces. Again, Why do we think they're doing that? Just out of the goodness of their hearts for the military? I mean, come on, people. There are these, you know, failing to miss the signs of the Ukrainian invasion where they were blatantly obvious. I want to invade Ukraine and take it back. I'm putting 120,000 troops on the border, you know, and I've got a load of tanks. I mean, really, was it a surprise? It shouldn't have been to anybody. We need to take these warnings seriously. But crucially, in terms of what we're actually doing, do you think that we would be able to actually repel a Russian invasion of our NATO allies? Do you think the Americans would, you know, come to aid? What about, you know, the Poles, new president elected in Poland, who believes that the role of, although, you know, less pro-EU than the other candidate, but he feels like the role of Poland is better outside NATO than inside it. What do you make of the willingness and ability of the West to take on Vladimir Putin and other threats?
It comes down to certainly writing off America at this point. I think all the messaging coming out of the White House, we cannot count on them as a reliable partner, so we need to write that part off and make sure that what we have is enough to repel Russia. And actually, a lot of Russia's military capability has been revealed to be a paper tiger over the last few years in Ukraine. Most notably the S-400 air defences, which Israeli F-35s wiped off the battlefield in Iran very easily. And the Ukrainians haven't been able to completely get air dominance because they've got parity on the ground there. So we've got a really good lesson from the Middle East. And that is that F-35s, which Ukraine doesn't have, can defeat Russia's air defences. And if you can defeat air defences, you can achieve air superiority. Yeah. And if you achieve air superiority, then you win. So I think we do have the abilities, we do have the capabilities to beat Russia on the battlefield. Russia, of course, will look at that and they will adjust their tactics accordingly, and they will go for a sort of salami slice approach where they don't ever quite reach the threshold of war until it's too late.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have to be very careful of our enemy's clever tactics.
Yeah, and he's shown that again and again, has he not? Andrew Fox, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much, Dee.